All right, good morning, everybody. It's for those of you that are here for the first time, we've been every session is its own kind of contained information. But there's also, as Drew mentioned, there's the concept of divine providence. It's not by chance that we're studying this discourse right now, considering that this week is the week in which we will celebrate. It's a hard word to say celebrate, but we will mark Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, holiest day on the Jewish calendar. We've been discussing the idea that there are two dimensions to our relationship with God. The lower dimension is what we call knowledge. The higher dimension is what we call faith. When we are close to something, when we have a personal relationship with something, we call that knowledge. Knowledge is not necessarily intellectual, it's much more experiential. So when we know something, like we know that we're alive, we don't have to explain that we're alive. We know that we're alive. It's just we have that knowledge, we have that feeling. And there are dimensions to God's presence that we know. You look outside, you see a beautiful, beautiful day. The sun is shining. There's not a cloud in the sky. Trees are beginning to change colors. We know that God is present. And then there's the higher dimension of God, which we are not that familiar with, because by definition, it's transcendent. And because it's transcendent, we don't have the same level of knowledge as it relates to that dimension of God. So that's where what we call faith comes in. In the discourse has been discussing that in the Messianic era, we will know the dimension of God that is currently at the level of faith. Right now, we have a limitation, the limitation of the body. And because we have a limitation of the body, we have a limitation in our ability to have a relationship, by definition, with something that is transcendent. What we started discussing last week is the nature of the changing of time. Time is defined by the finiteness of existence. We discussed the concept of a heartbeat. A heartbeat is this tension that exists within the person, the soul wanting to return to its source and the body holding the soul back. We have that heartbeat within all of creation. All of creation, on the one hand, yearning to be restored to its creator, and at the same time, fulfilling the instruction of its creator to be present, to give life to the physical existence down here. And he said something very powerful. He discussed the changing of time in history. We see in the Torah, we see in the books of the prophets, we see in the books of the scriptures that there was an era when the people followed God, and then there was an era when the people rejected God. And then they followed God and they rejected God, and they followed God and they rejected God. And that's part of the nature of the heartbeat of existence, is that things do not remain constant. What do they say? The only thing that is constant is change, right? And that's because the definition of a finite world is that it's constantly being recreated. There's a new energy, and therefore things don't stay the same, which allows for us to actually have profound compassion on ourselves and the journey that each of us experience, which is that on the one hand, we yearn for connection, and that is coming from the soul. And on the other hand, our body is preoccupied with self. And so inevitably, there are going to be times where we feel more connected, we feel more godly, we feel more driven to that connection. There are times that we're going to be more preoccupied with self and self-interest. So on the bottom of page 31, we'll pick up from that right in the middle of the page where it says, therefore, A person should not be dejected. They should not be dispirited when they see that they fall spiritually, because that's the nature of the changing of time. That just as it's possible for a person to go from positive to negative, so too it's possible for a person to go from negative to positive. And all of this exists in the framework of time and space. All of this exists in the level of the relationship that we have with God as He fills our current reality. If God were visible to us, then we would not be able to exist within time and space. If God were visible to us, we would naturally be subsumed by God's presence, and therefore we would not be able to function as independent beings. So our journey on this earth is to navigate this struggle between recognition of God's presence in the world around us, albeit concealed, and at the same time to yearn to utilize the world and the physical reality around us in the service of God. And inevitably, we're going to have struggles with that. We're not going to remain consistent because that's the nature of time. That's the nature of existence. But that's all within the framework of God as He's manifest within our reality. Page 32. If we want to connect with that transcendent dimension of God, the first thing we need to do is we need to eliminate the negativity, eliminate the evil. We discussed this in an earlier class, that what is evil? In Jewish thought, evil is not an independent power. Judaism believes that the only power is the power of God, and there is no independent power. So what is it that we experience when we see negativity in the world? In simple terms, that is the absence of the presence of God that allows for people to think that they're that important that they can make their interest the priority. And that's what happens. When someone chooses to put themselves before purpose, they perpetrate evil. And that could be evil things that we see in the world, and it could also be the things that happen within our own personal lives when we allow the self to dominate over the godliness that's present. So the first step to having a relationship with a transcendent God is you've got to eliminate the ego. You've got to eliminate the self. That's really difficult to do, because when we wake up in the morning, our first consciousness is the consciousness of self. And frankly, as long as we're going to be alive, a soul in a body, we are going to have an interest in self that's never going to go away. We're never going to not need food. We're never not going to need sleep. We're never not going to need to make a living. And because we're going to have all of these needs, we're going to naturally sometimes put our interests first. That's just the nature of things. In the Messianic era, which by definition means that the consciousness of God is going to be present, right? Which, as we said, cannot be now, because then we lose our purpose. But in the Messianic era, when the consciousness of God is going to be present, so then the negativity will go away. The prophet says, as he reads, it says in the next paragraph, the prophet Zechariah says that in the Messianic era, the spirit of impurity will be removed from the earth, which means that the spirit of self-interest is going to be removed because the consciousness is going to be a consciousness of God. Does this make sense? Any questions, comments?
Is that something God's going to do supernaturally in the world? Is He waiting for human beings to pull that off?
It's a great question. So what triggers the Messianic era is our efforts. the more we live that within our own lives, the more we live consistent with the true consciousness, the more the world becomes transformed. However, ultimately, the ushering in of the Messianic era is something that will come from above. So it's in a sense, it's a partnership. We have to do our part, and when God feels the time is right, that's when the Mashiach will come. So the answer to your question, as a good Jewish answer, is yes. They're both true. We have to do our part, and God will do his part. Yes.
Where does the Bible mention Satan? He said, he just didn't give it a name. He said ego and negative. So did he mention Satan?
Yeah, so we find the most explicit expression of Satan is in the story of Job, when the opening of the book of Job says that the Satan had a conversation with God to challenge Job. But we have to put that in context. That's for you. Has your name on it. We have to put that in context. So the first time we find the word Satan is in the story of Bilam. So Bilam was the non-Jewish prophet who was hired by the king of Balak, the king of Moab, to curse the Jews. And the Torah tells us the story of how he attempted to curse the Jews, and every time he attempted, things got in his way, and he ultimately blessed the Jews instead of cursing them. At one point, the Torah tells us the story of the talking donkey, where Bilam saddles his donkey, and he's going on the road, and the Torah tells us that there was an angel that stood in the road to turn him away from the path. And Bilam hits his donkey, and the donkey then begins to speak and says, why are you hitting me? Have I not been faithful to you all these years? And then at that moment, Bilam's eyes open up and he sees the angel standing on the road, and he justifies his beating of the donkey because he didn't see the angel. But the word the Torah uses for the angel being on the road to cause him to turn away is L'satan lo haderach, to turn him from the path. Of course, the word is Satan, right? So what does the word Satan mean? The word Satan means to turn away. So in Jewish thought, there is no power that rivals God. There's not this force that is challenging God, but it's the challenge of the ego. It's the challenge of the self that causes us to turn away from God. And the angel is just an example of that, where we have things that simply because we don't see the presence of God, that's why we allow for ourselves and our self-interest to take precedence. But had we seen the angel, had we had the ability to see the presence of God in the world around us, then we would only do what's in God's interest. But the key to all of this is to understand that this is part of the programming, right? This is not a bug, this is a feature. The fact that we have an ego is not, it's not a bad thing. It's where we get our purpose from, which is, I think, the messaging that the Alter Rebbe is trying to make here is that stop beating yourself up for the fact that you have your self-interest, from the fact that you even sometimes fall, sometimes fail, and that you put your ego first. That's part of the program. I think it's a really important message as we enter into Yom Kippur, a Day of Atonement, is that so much of our challenge is our own problem. Meaning we judge ourselves so harshly for the fact that we're human, that we carry such shame, and that prevents us from actually doing what we need to, which is to stay connected with God. And if we understand that this is part of God's programming for us to have self-interest, to have a preoccupation with what serves me, then we're able to look at the circumstances with much more compassion and to be able to choose, even when we feel a self-interest, to choose to do what God wants, what's in God's interest, and not necessarily what's in our interest. Make sense? Any other questions? Okay. 32, middle of the page. This is not the case as it was in the time after the destruction of the temple. In the first temple, there were false prophets. And in the second temple, there was baseless hatred. These challenges of false prophets, which drove the people to worship false gods, and baseless hatred, these are the opposites of the faith that one strives for. Let's break that down. What does it mean to worship idols? So there's the ancient worship of idols, which for most of the West is not a challenge today. Most of us don't wake up in the morning and have this great urge to bow down to a statue. But back in the day, that's what it was. But we have a different form of worship, which is we worship materialism. We prioritize materialism. We prioritize our self-interests. So in a sense, we worship the dollar bill. We worship, you don't have to go too far. We see this all over social media, right? What carries the popularity of an influencer? It's a bunch of fakeness. It's a bunch of falseness, right? People welcome. It's people prioritizing the stuff that meets the eye. It's the external stuff that people get excited about that gives people so much energy. So in a sense, I mean, think about a given day. What gives you anxiety in a given day? Most of what gives us anxiety is ego.
What?
Ego, right? Think about it. Think about something that bothered you today or last week. It was a person who we gave too much power to them. It might be a thing that we gave too much priority for. Many years ago, I stopped looking at social media. Chabad has a great social media account, but I have other people that manage it. Why? Because what happens? You get on social media and you see all the stuff that your friends are posting, and you get angsty. Look at my friend, they went on this vacation. Look at that friend, they bought this new house. Look at that one, they got this new car. This one has all these likes on their post. And then you suddenly find yourself like all agitated. But what are you agitated about? A bunch of fakeness. It's a bunch of falsity. It's a bunch of people who are putting forth an image of the way they want you to see them. So in a sense, we're actually worshiping Instagram, Facebook. We're worshiping the materialism that these people are portraying in front of us. So in the first temple, he says there were false prophets. The prophets driving people to worship other gods. So maybe in those days, there were these powers that they believed in, the sun and the moon and the galaxies. And in our times, it's the same thing. It's the worship of stuff and things and ego. In the second temple, the great sin of the second temple was baseless hatred, which is in a certain sense even more ominous. That's not the right word. It's more pernicious is a good word, because why do you have this hatred towards another person? Now there's I don't want to say justified, but there's hatred that has a basis for it, right? Which is much easier to deal with. If I dislike you because you're more successful than I am, okay, so I can work through that. I have language to understand what it is that's the source of my hatred, and I can work through that. If I dislike you because you did something to me that I feel was you wronged me, right? Okay, so I can work on that. I can work on that by recognizing that God is present in every story. So even something that occurs to me, ultimately, nobody has any power over me, only God does, right? So if something happens to me, it's ultimately God wanting that to happen. I'm going to speak about forgiveness on Yom Kippur, forgiveness towards others that have wronged you. And some of the ideas there, number one, is when somebody does something that you believe is wrong. So we have to recognize that God is in the story. We have the greatest example of that perhaps in the Torah is the story of Joseph and his brothers who sold him into slavery. And when finally they're reunited, the brothers are carrying a lot of shame around their behavior. And what does Joseph say to them? Don't be ashamed, draw near, because it was not you who sent me, but it was God that sent me. In other words, we can't always see how a story plays out. Sometimes we are fortunate to look back and say, oh, if not for that event, this wouldn't have happened and my life wouldn't be the way it is with all of its blessings. So sometimes we're fortunate to see that in hindsight. But that doesn't justify carrying that hatred towards that person in the present. And in fact, if you knew that that negative act that they perpetrated would actually bring you to the blessing, you might not have been angry. You might have been thankful to them. One of my favorite stories about this is the story of Bernie Marcus. We're in Home Depot town, where I forget the guy's name from Handy Dan, who didn't like him, had it out for him, and he bullied him until eventually he fired him. So here was a guy who was making money for the company, lots of money, but the CEO had such hatred towards him that he ousted him. Now, the guy was a bully, by all accounts, but when Bernie got fired, his friend Ken Langone told him, you've just been given a golden horseshoe kick in the ass, excuse my French. They said, go and start the Home Depot that you've been dreaming of. And that's where Home Depot was born. So this multi-billion-dollar company that has, the result of it, Bernie and the company has done so much good for people. How many people have they given jobs to? The Bernie's generosity of building hospitals and, all kinds of wonderful things in the world happened because a guy hated him and had him ousted. Had he not, he might have continued staying in that company, made them a lot of money, and that would have been the end of the story. So in that moment, had he been able to see what had happened, he would have said, you know what, thank you so much for doing this, right? But by the way, had he had the gratitude, he may not have either been motivated to start the company. So all of the experiences around a negative behavior from someone towards us is all part of the design. Our job is to try to navigate that, to try to struggle through that, to realize, even though in this moment I don't see how your actions are actually good for me, but I believe that God is in control. God is the master of the plan, and therefore, ultimately, it will be for a blessing. So I don't have to carry around all this negativity. But there's another layer to that, another layer to forgiveness, which is that perhaps it's us that's the problem. And I don't mean to make us the victim when somebody perpetrates a negativity towards us, but oftentimes, definitely in more subtle circumstances, our judgment of the other is not their problem, it's our problem. We have hypersensitivity. We have a story that helps us frame the experience of another. And if we were able to shift, then we would be able to see the story differently. Which all brings us back to the same point. We don't have that ability necessarily to shift, not instantly anyway, because we have an ego. And our ego is the filter through which we see our story. So those are all these kind of negative feelings towards others that are based on some kind of rationale. But then there are people that we just dislike. We have no basis for it. So that's an ugliness of the ego at a higher level, right? Your existence bothers me. It doesn't bother my soul. It bothers my body. It bothers my ego. So it's the antithesis of God's revelation in the temple, which ought to bring us to a state of consciousness that every person is a creation of God. Every person has merit. And instead, we have this baseless hatred towards another that is indicative of how wrapped up we are in our ego. Again, had we had the faith, had we experienced the transcendent dimension of God, we would see that in everything. By the way, the righteous, the people who are righteous, truly righteous people, holy people, see through the filter. Because they see through the filter, they welcome everybody. I'm going to just share a quick story. There's a beautiful story of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was the founder of Hasidism, and one Friday night he was walking with his students, and they passed by a tavern. And in the tavern was one of the students of the Baal Shem Tov who was partying with the peasants there. So one of the students of the Baal Shem Tov turned to him and said, look at that guy. Look what he's doing on Shabbos. It's what a terrible thing. So the Baal Shem Tov let the guy finish, and then he turned to him and he said, are you jealous? End of story. What was the Baal Shem Tov's point? It wasn't the person's sin that bothered him. It was his ego. It was his ego. But the Baal Shem Tov only saw blessing in the other person. He saw the goodness in the other person. Okay, he saw that the person had faults, but the person's faults were something to be worked with. How do we look ourselves in the mirror? When we have faults, when we look in the mirror with our own faults, do we say, oh, I'm such a terrible person, I'm worthless, I'm hopeless? We say, no, I've got these faults, but if you would only know why I have these faults, and if you would only know my story, you wouldn't judge me so much, right? That's how we look at ourselves. We make excuses for ourselves. Why? Because we love ourselves. We see ourselves as we truly are in our purest fashion. But because of our ego, we don't look at others in that way. Go ahead.
I want to go back to your second point you made about baseless hatred, where someone commits a wrongdoing against you, internalizing and you don't feel forgiveness over time, and ultimately about yourself. I want to make sure I'm interpreting it correctly. Is it to say that the reason you haven't forgiven is because internally or with your unconscious, you just simply haven't learned from it yet? That you haven't learned a lesson from it, and like what it tells you about yourself, what it tells you about the experience to set you on the right path?
Yeah, I would expand that a little bit. It's not only about a lesson, but using that idea of learning the lesson, it's learning the essence of what the experience is about. So sometimes it's a lesson to be learned, and sometimes it's just, sometimes the lesson is I have to stop being so preoccupied with self. And if I'm not as preoccupied with self, then I'll be able to see the goodness in every circumstance, at least believe the goodness as a dominant.
Then a short, like, how long you saying, when you get that point, he doesn't have that quick message in his mind that God's doing this.
Yeah.
It's not the other stuff. The other part has to penetrate.
Yeah, we touched on this a little bit last time, that if we collect information, right, we're studying here, we're downloading information, and the information is powerful. And in this moment, it makes all the sense in the world. And for each of us, we might be thinking about that individual that we may have this kind of hatred towards or dislike to. We may identify with our own, I don't want to use a cliche, but our own self-loathing, right? And we want to walk out of here looking at other people more positively. But we don't, because the gap between the ego and the response is too narrow. Our work is to work on expanding that gap. Viktor Frankl said that the choice takes place between reaction and between, it wasn't the word trigger because they didn't use the word trigger back then, but whatever I think it was stimuli and response, right? I think, is that correct? I think it's between stimuli and response. So our job is to recognize that the stimuli is the body. It's the ego. The more we work on that, the more we create space between the stimuli and the response. By the way, the response is internal also. Of course, it's external, but it's internal as well. So one of the great things, today we communicate a lot via text and via email. We gave this course earlier in this year, The Art of Relationships. And one of the things that often happens in a relationship is somebody does something that bothers you, and you feel like you need to respond right away. Oftentimes, if we give it a break, don't respond to that text. Give yourself an hour. Just set yourself a timer. Say, "Oh man, that guy really got under my skin." But I'm gonna wait an hour till I respond. During that hour, you calm down. Your stimuli is calmed down, and then you're able to process. Now, you may not be able to process to the point where you say, "Oh, this person's really a good person. I misinterpret it." Sometimes that happens. But even if you don't get to that point, you say, "You know what? I want to live higher. I don't want my response to be an ego-driven response. I want it to be a compassionate response." And the response oftentimes is going to be much softer. So not everything needs to be resolved in the moment. Now, can we do that within ourselves? Can we get triggered within ourselves about something about ourselves and reserve judgment? Say, I see what I'm experiencing, but I'm gonna put that aside and come back and visit it in an hour from now, so that I don't have to be so harshly judgmental of self. So the more we study and the more we meditate on this, the more we work on this, the greater the gap between the stimuli and the response, which oftentimes allows for us not to have a negative response at all, and actually to see things as they are aligned with God. Yes.
Okay, so what about like when people do like heinous crimes, like children, women, children, like what does the Torah and the prophets say, like when it's okay not to kiss, or are you supposed to forgive?
Okay, so let's elaborate on the concept of forgiveness for a moment, because I want to contextualize that from a Jewish standpoint. We can only forgive someone for something that they did to us. I can't forgive someone for something they did to someone else. I can't forgive someone for something that they did to God. Not because I can't forgive them. It's not my place to forgive them. They did something against God. They got to take it up with God. I can forgive someone for something they did to me. Now, forgiveness does not mean absolution, right? If somebody did something genuinely wrong to you, the question here is not about whether they have to pay the price for the crime that they committed or the sin that they did. They have to make amends, but I have the ability not to carry the negativity towards them. So if I work on that within myself, I can say, well, I remember years ago, many years ago, it was not a significant event in the world, but I was listening to the radio. I was studying in New York at the time, and I was listening to the radio, and there was some murderer who was on Rikers Island, and they were interviewing his mother, and she said, I forgive him, and I still love him. And I thought to myself, how can you forgive him for what he murdered someone else? He didn't murder you. He murdered someone else. How do you have the right to forgive him? You want to say you still love him? I can respect that, but you can't, which might be difficult for me to swallow, right? But I can understand a mother's love. But how do you have the right to forgive him for something he perpetrated against someone else? I don't have the right to do that. So forgiveness belongs to God. Now, in Jewish practice, open up the 5 books of Moses and you'll see sins that have severe consequences. And the court is obligated to adjudicate those consequences. They don't have the luxury of saying, well, we're going to forgive this person for having committed murder or whatever else the Torah, any other sin that the Torah has the court responsible to adjudicate. Our job is to mete out the punishment, but in meting out the punishment, our job is to move away from judgment not about the action, about the person's intent. We don't get, it's an interesting thing. In the times of the temple, in the temple, there was something called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the high court. It was a court of 72 people that sat in the temple. And our tradition tells us that when the Sanhedrin, when the temple was destroyed and the Sanhedrin was dismantled, we're no longer allowed to engage in capital punishment. So in the times of the temple, there was capital punishment, but when the temple is destroyed, we're no longer allowed to mete out those punishments. Okay. So now today you have somebody who commits a sin that the Torah says earns the punishment of capital punishment. So what happens to them today? There's in the news right now, I don't know if anybody's seen it, that Israel is debating. Israel doesn't have a capital punishment policy. The only time Israel gave capital punishment was to Eichmann. There's a debate now that's taking place in Israel whether the murderers of October 7th should receive capital punishment. It's a big debate. But that's the state of Israel, not Jewish law. Jewish law doesn't have a place for capital punishment today. So when we mete out capital punishment, we're actually doing a loving kindness to the individual, because we are, by the Torah's instruction, capital punishment is a form of atonement for them. But if we don't have capital punishment, so where does that leave the person? Okay, so the Kabbalistic masters teach us that we have a certain gift today that they didn't have in the times of the temple, which even for sins that would otherwise bring about capital punishment, one could achieve forgiveness while on this earth. Now, that doesn't mean you should hang out with that person. And I'm going to expand that. When you see a person who lets their ego drive them to the point where they can do negative things towards other people, we can be compassionate to them, but that doesn't mean we have to treat ourselves like a rag and let ourselves be trampled on. And that's a very delicate balance to get to, because today in particular, people have their truth and they cut off relationships and so on and so forth. And oftentimes it's not the other person's ego that's the problem, but it's their own ego. They can't tolerate the other person. They can't handle the other person, so they cut them off. Sometimes it's legitimate, but oftentimes it's my own ego that's saying, you're not good for me, so therefore I'm going to keep you away. If you're really not good for me, there's a different way to experience that. My trauma, my story is so alert that you trigger that. Okay, but let's be honest about it. It's not about the other person, it's about me. Right? If I'm hypersensitive, I'm going to be hypersensitive to everything. It's not the other person's problem, it's my problem. Again, it's back to the ego. So forgiveness is something that we can achieve even when somebody did something that's truly heinous, but that doesn't mean that they need to hang out with the rest of society. But we can still find compassion for them. Is that sitting well with you?
Okay, so the only thing I don't know, the reference you made was Eichmann.
Yeah, he was Adolf Eichmann. He was a Nazi. It's a fascinating story if you want to look it up. Adolf Eichmann was a Nazi that was part of the mastermind of the final solution. He himself murdered many people, and then after World War II, he escaped to Argentina. And I think this was in the early 60s, if I'm not mistaken. The early 60s. There's a number of movies that have been made. One pretty recently, in the last 10 years. There used to be, it was called The House on Gabrielti Street. Anyway, there's a recent one, I think it's actually called Eichmann. So Israel, the Mossad went into Argentina and they captured him, they drugged him, they flew him back to Israel, and then he stood trial for the murders that he committed in World War II, and he was ultimately executed. So that's that story.
Oh, okay, I think I've heard it.
Yeah. It was the one and only time Israel, engaged in capital punishment. And I don't know the backstory why they chose to actually kill him as opposed to continuing with their policy. I don't know enough of the backstory. It's before my time.
I think it's a different realm when one speaks of active defense of your people versus capital punishment. When someone's been rendered non-lethal and they're awaiting judgment or given an opportunity to atone. So
he was unrepentant.
Exactly.
Yeah, he was unrepentant.
Yeah. And but also, I mean, just to speak of things that are even happening today, as far as folks engaging in ways to protect their people, that kind of thing. That's another balance of itself. Sure.
Yeah, look, good people struggle with moral questions, right? Bad people don't struggle with it. That's the bottom line. So if you're not bothered by what's going on in the world, it doesn't mean that what's going on in the world is right or wrong. It just means you're not struggling with it. And just because I'm struggling with it doesn't either mean that what they're doing is wrong or right? So we have to, again, it's all part of the same underlying thing. If my ego is where my thinking comes from, right? That's what drives my thinking. my moral compass is not necessarily coming from my soul. My moral compass is coming from my thinking. Compassion can be very easily misplaced. So we can't allow the emotions and the body to dictate what is moral and immoral. We have to look to the Torah. We have to look to a higher power, and ask that higher power, what does the Torah say about this circumstance? What does the Torah say about this situation? What's our responsibility in that situation? I mentioned this in passing last week. You know, you get off the highway and you see somebody asking for help, and you're inclined to give them money because that's what your ego says. That's what your emotions say. It doesn't mean at the core of it, it's not coming from a good place. But if you want to do the right thing, go take them to McDonald's and buy them a sandwich. If they're really hungry, then help them. If you're going to give them $10, they're going to go buy a bottle of vodka. So are you just trying to assuage your discomfort, or are you actually trying to help the person? That's a brain process that is removed from the emotion, that then looks and says, what is the right thing? A parent raising a child, sometimes it's easier to give the kid the candy than to actually say no. Or the cell phone, different types of candy.
So with Kabbalah, is it kind of like the idea that there is no absolute?
Why do you say that?
I mean, because like think about like, you know, thou shalt not kill, but in certain situations, it's okay.
So the Torah doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. Absolutely. Killing means to take a person's life. Murdering means to take a person's life unjustifiably. So if somebody is trying to take your life, if you don't take their life first, you're liable for your life. And if there's somebody who's about to murder another person and you don't take them out, and you have the ability to, you're liable for that murder. You're not necessarily going to receive capital punishment, but you're liable for that murder. It's no different than seeing somebody starving on the street, begging you for food, and you choose to ignore them. There's an interesting thing in U.S. law. We don't talk about obligations in this country. We talk about rights, right? In Jewish law, if you're walking down the street and you see somebody who's drowning and you have the ability to save them and you don't, you're culpable for that. In U.S. law, you're not. You have the right not to save them. That's not a moral question. That's a question of rights. So Kabbalah is Torah, and Torah has absolutes. Are there areas where Torah says there's gray area? Absolutely. But that's when the Torah tells us it's a gray area, not when we choose for it to be a gray area.
So what are the gray?
I'll give you an easy example. I mean, it's vast, but I'll give you an easy example. It's the Sabbath. It's Shabbat. And somebody's life may be in danger. Are you allowed to violate the Shabbos to save their life? So the answer is, so you might say that's a gray area. It's maybe not a great example, but even when there's a doubt as to saving a person's life, we're obligated to save their life. We're obligated to violate the Sabbath in order to save their life. It's a very interesting thing. It says that one is obligated to transgress God's commandments so that we have life, except for the three big sins, which is worship of other gods, murder, and illicit relationships. I'm not allowed to say that I'm going to commit this murder so that someone else won't kill me. Right? I'm not allowed to say that I'm going to worship this other God so that my life will be spared. And those have very specific reasons. Okay, we'll let you digest that for a week. Okay, so bringing it back here. So these two sins, the sin of worship of other gods and baseless hatred, they are the antithesis of the concept of faith. Because faith, as we said, transcends the limits of logic. And here are behaviors that transcend the limits of logic, but in a negative way. Worshipping other gods that don't have power is transcending the limits of logic, and to hate others without reason is also to transcend the limits of logic. Va'inyan, to explain this idea, so we have the idea of what we call normal behavior, right? What is normal behavior? Normal behavior is things that we can rationalize to each other. When you see a person acting crazy, right? Why? It means that normal behavior that we all think makes sense, this person's acting different than that norm. They're acting in a way that's not logical. But there are two non-logical ways of behaving. There's one way that's non-logical behaving that is sub-logic. It's nonsense. So nonsense also, by definition, is nonsense. There's no logic to it. But then there's acting without logic because you're transcending the logic. You're doing something that's above logic. When we're talking about relating to a God that we can't see, that's transcendent, by definition, that is not logical. So when we are in service, that's coming from a place of faith. By the way, in the Torah, we have three types of commandments. We have commandments that are called laws, which you might say are logical laws. Then we have laws that are symbolisms. They symbolize a relationship. They symbolize an event in history. And then there are decrees. God's decrees don't have logic for us. They are above logic. And we do them simply because God tells us to do them. Through the ages, the great sages have given some meaning to some of these laws. But ultimately, they're transcended. Ultimately, they're beyond our comprehension. So why do we do them? Because we have faith, which means why? What's the answer to the logical question, why? It's an illogical answer. It's a super rational answer. I'm doing it even though I don't understand because I believe in a God that's beyond comprehension who tells me to act in such and such a manner.
I have a question.
Yes.
When it comes to faith, when you start to feel like you're losing faith, how would you build it up to be able to hold on to that belief?
Good. So earlier in the discourse, I explained two things. Number one, that we have to begin with the level of faith. A relationship doesn't fall apart on the essence before it falls apart on the outside, right? People don't fall out of love until they stop doing the things that people who love each other do. So if we invest ourselves in the relationship with God that is accessible, if we take the time, and he mentioned this earlier in the discourse, if we take time to pray, and prayer is really a form of meditation, of thinking about the blessings in our lives, thinking about the presence of God in the world. So we even though that's a level of a relationship with God that we can relate to, we can look at our lives, we can look at nature around us, we can look at the functioning of the universe, and we can say there must be a mastermind to this existence, that must be God, and therefore I believe in that dimension of God. So that's the first thing to do, is to invest in the relationship. The second thing he said is to do the actions that channel the relationship. So when we fulfill God's commandments, we are actually bringing down an awareness, a connection with God into our experience. There's a humorous story. I may have said this story here once before. A man really hates his wife. He despises her. He despises her so much that he will not, and he doesn't want her to have any pleasure, to the point that he won't even grant her a divorce, because then she'll see, I told you were a no goodnik, right? So he's not even going to grant her a divorce, but he's in this conundrum. He hates his wife. He wants a divorce, but he's not going to give her the divorce because then she'll have the pleasure that she was right? You get the humor in that. If you're married or been married, you understand that. You don't have to be a male. It goes both ways, right? So he comes to the rabbi with his dilemma and he says, Rabbi, what do I do? So the rabbi says it's brought down in the Talmud that one who makes a pledge to charity and doesn't keep the pledge, their spouse and their children die young. So he tells the man, he says, go and make a pledge to charity and don't make good on the pledge, and it'll all work out. So he goes to the synagogue and they're conducting a capital campaign and they need $100,000 to close out the campaign, and he pledges $100,000. Everybody's very happy. A few days later, the president comes to his door and says, sir, it's time to pay up the pledge. He says, I'm not paying it up. So what do you mean? I'm just not paying it. What do you do? They wait a few weeks. They come back to him and got to pay the pledge. I'm not paying it. Anyway, in the meantime, he's waiting for his wife to die. She's not dying. So day in, day out, he's waiting. One day he's going to show up and she's going to be dead, and it's not happening. So he comes back to the rabbi and he says, what do I do? It's not working. So the rabbi says, she's on to you. And the only way this works is if she doesn't know that she's on to you, that she doesn't know that you got a plan here. He says, well, how do I do that? He says, well, treat her with love. Treat her like she shouldn't know that there's something going on. So he starts bringing her flowers. He starts bringing her gifts. He starts actually paying attention to her when she's talking. And time goes by, and suddenly he finds out that he actually loves her. All this hatred was superficial. And he starts feeling these strong feelings of love towards her. And then one day he says, oh my gosh, she's going to die. I don't want her to die. So he comes back to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, what do I do? The rabbi says, you got to pay up the pledge. Huh? So what's the point? The point is, back in the day, growing up, we used to have a Chevy Chevette. Anybody remember the Chevy Chevette? So a little, Chevy Chevette was a tiny little car. We were 11 children, and oftentimes our cousins would come over as well. My mother was a tiny little lady, and she would get into the Chevy Chevette. This was before seatbelts were actually enforced, and we would pack all of us into this. We were like in the back, in the hatchback. We were like packed in there. What happens when a shift car doesn't get started? What would you do? You push it. You push it. Right? Start rolling it down a hill, and then it would kick into gear. Now, sometimes the ego stops up the soul, to your question. The soul always, the prophet says that the soul is always ba'amna itai. The soul is always in a perpetual state of faith. So it's never the soul that's lost its faith. It's the ego, it's the body that's become preoccupied with other stuff that stops that up. So how do you get the engine started? You got to do the right things. Sometimes that there's a they call it a meme today. They probably called it a motto back in the day or something, right? It takes many more muscles to frown than it takes to smile, right? So what happens when you're not feeling in a good mood? Fake it, smile, dance a little bit, put on some music, and you'll find yourself in a good mood. Why? What happened to the mood? What happened to the mood? It disappeared? Because the mood was a preoccupation with self. And if you let yourself go, the ego go, the light at the core shines forth. So we feel stopped up because our bodies, when you spend that much time, which again, to what he mentioned earlier, that's the human condition. When we spend that much time preoccupied with self, we're going to become desensitized to the things that are really important. If you spend your days eating and pursuing a living and worrying about this and worrying about that, you're disconnected from the source of life. And if you can let the source of life out by living, even if it's just in actions, even if it's just in occasional actions, a little more selfless, meaning more plugged in with what your soul wants, the soul's going to shine inside of you. And when the soul shines inside of you, you're plugged into the faith that's at the core there. You approve? Approve this message? Any other questions?
Yeah, I say instead of dancing, go and ride a bicycle like me on Mercedes, and then I can instead of taking.
That's definitely helpful. By the way, therapists who are dealing with people that are struggling with depression and negativity encourage exercise. I mean, it's good for everybody to exercise, but if you exercise, not just, you know, a little bit, but you sweat a little bit, you're calming the body down from its preoccupation with self. The more we do that, the more the soul comes out. Now, exercise is not enough because exercise can become its own form of worship. So we got to balance that out. Yom Kippur is this week. I'll be happy to take a few more questions, but Yom Kippur is this week, Wednesday evening. Yeah, get the right day.
Okay.
There's a fantastic story of a cantor who I think this happened maybe in the 90s, who was hired by a synagogue in Berlin to lead the services. And it was a small congregation, and at the end of Yom Kippur, when the services were over, everybody broke their fast, they went home. The cantor was locking up the synagogue, and an old Russian fellow comes rushing to the door, and he says, "Is the Kol Nidre over yet?" Kol Nidre is the prayer that we say at the beginning. And the cantor says, "You're a day late." The guy realized, he was so devastated. The cantor says, "Come inside with me." Went inside, and the cantor did the whole Kol Nidre for him, just for this person. So that was a good way to start the year, a mitzvah like that. So that's Wednesday evening. On Thursday morning, we begin services at 9:30, and we have a learner service. So if you want to learn the meaning of the prayers, learn the meaning of the holiday, that'll take place down here at 10 o'clock, and then check out all the other fun stuff on the website.
Wednesday is
Wednesday evening
What time?
Thursday.
till Thursday night, yeah.
What time does this start?
Around 7 o'clock. You had a question?
Yeah. How would you follow explain the difference between like ego and self-expression? I know they're not exactly the same, but how would you like differentiate that? 'Cause I can tell there's some. Yeah.
That's a great question. It's a fantastic question, because part of our journey of figuring out the ego is learning how to decipher what is in my interest, my ego's interests, and what is truly beyond. So first of all, just a simple definition. Self-expression is not necessarily an expression of soul. It may be driven by the soul, but it's not necessarily soul. In other words, a person's, let's say, artistic ability, right? Artistic ability belongs to the body, not to the soul. It may be energized by the soul. It may be the soul's purpose to manifest itself in a particular individual through their artistic ability. Not maybe, it is, right? We each of us are given talents and gifts, and each soul has a unique purpose on this earth. And we discover that purpose by finding where our greatest challenges are and where our greatest gifts are. And when we can identify these two things within our own lives, that's where our soul's purpose is manifest. But self-expression can also be an ego trip, right? We can couch it in all kinds of flowery terms, but at the end of the day, it's an ego trip that I want popularity because of my expression of my artistic expression. So, and again, to what he said earlier in the discourse, that's okay. That's okay, because the soul needs the body to achieve this objective of expression in these artistic abilities. Our work is to navigate within ourselves as to what is really driving my self-expression. Is it my ego, or is it to be in service? And we may bounce back and forth between those two things. But as long as there is a part of us that sees in this self-expression a higher purpose, then that becomes aligned. In other words, there's nothing, not just there's nothing wrong. God put the soul in a body. So you would say, well, if I'm eating, I'm just serving my body, so I'm not going to eat. Well, that doesn't work. If you don't eat, then your soul can't fulfill its purpose here. So you need to eat. The question is, are you going to eat in service of self, or am I going to eat because I need to be energized in order to be in service to God and service to others? So that's our work. There's no simple formula to say, oh, this experience is the soul and this one is the body. It is specifically in the struggle that we find the soul. It's when we're navigating what's my driver right here that I'm able to find out. By the way, we have this in most profoundly in relationships, right? When I love, sure, there's an ego that's involved in there. My body loves, but it's also my soul that loves. When does a relationship flourish? When the parties in the relationship move past the interests of the body and do what's in interest of the love. And what's in interest of the love is the other. That's the definition of true love, is it's not about me, it's about you. So I want A, B, and C, but you want something else. I'm going to do what you want. So in some cases, it's more explicit, and some it's much more subtle, and we have to navigate that. It's a lot of work.
Yeah. Generally speaking, ego is the whole absolute thing. Ego is bad.
No. Ego is neutral. Ego is neutral. Ego, think of, you have an animal, a pet?
Yeah.
What do you have?
Cat.
A cat?
Cat.
Okay. There used to be a commercial. The cat says, this is my house, you just live here, right? I mean, you look at a cat, and the cat kind of is conveying that message, and I'm in charge. A cat is just an animal. It's just, it's hardwired to behave in a certain way. A dog is hardwired to behave in a certain way. We may feel a closeness, we may feel a love from an animal. No different than a tiger or a lion. They're just not good to have as pets, right? No different than, any ferocious animal or a little hamster. They're all pre-programmed. And what is their programming? Their programming is, I'm the only thing in the world, and I am going to do whatever is necessary, whatever is within my capacity to take care of myself. So if that means to hunt down a deer, I'm going to go do that and kill the deer. You're not going to say the lion's a bad lion that it hunted down a deer, right? And when we try to domesticate animals and they don't behave the way we want them to be domesticated, we train them. What is training? Training is just like you would train a child. Punishment and reward. If you poop on the carpet, we're going to put you outside of the house. If you don't, you'll get an extra biscuit, right? So it's just a programming. Would you say any animal is bad? No animal is bad. No animal is good. It's just an animal. They're just, people tell their dogs, oh, you're a good dog. They're not a good dog. They're no more a good dog than they're a bad dog. They're just a dog that if you train them well, they're going to behave in a certain way. That's what our body is.
Is that human beings too?
That's what our body is.
Ego is linked to the body.
Yes. Ego is a consciousness of self. The human body is an animal. We're an animal. Without the soul, we're a piece of meat.
I know, like, where it wants to serve itself.
Correct. So you look at a newborn baby.
Are you saying that the ego is all animal?
The ego is all animal. Yes. Now, speak up. It's the operating system. It's exactly what it is. Without the soul, the operating system's not plugged in. When it's plugged in, the operating system is functioning. Our job, so there's in the 12 steps, there's a term, ego gone awry, right? What does that mean, ego gone awry? Ego gone awry means where the function of the ego ought to be to take care of my needs, right? Human beings take that to the next level, where like the Torah says that there's a bird called the chasida, which means kind. And the Torah says, why is it called kind? Because it's kind to its young. A lot of animals, they birth their offspring and they let them go. This bird takes care of its young. It's not a kosher bird. The question, why is it not a kosher bird? Because it only takes care of its young and none others. In other words, it defines itself by its kindness, but its kindness is a selfish kindness. So ego gone awry is when my preoccupation with self begins to take the place of how I treat others, which goes back to our conversation. What is when my ego is not ready to subjugate itself to something greater, which usually manifests itself when I'm going to do what's in my interest at the expense of another, or in my interest at the expense of fulfilling God's commands, that's ego gone awry. And because we have that capacity, we could perpetrate evil in that process. Not just selfish behaviors, but actual evils. That's what every great dictator did, is their ego was they were so preoccupied with self and their self-importance that they justified hurting others so that they can stay in power.
I have a question on your reference to culture. Because I think with culture, I know this sounds stupid, but I think meat, like I think of meat as like eat. So how does that compare to a bird philosophically?
Birds are also meat.
So
But the feeding thing.
like, so if a bird takes care only at spring, it's not culture,
So
right? Fish culture?
fish that have fins and scales. So interesting. The reason I just gave about this bird and common misconception about what is kosher is rational reasons. Kosher actually belongs to the category of commandments, which I referenced earlier, that is divine decree.
Like you have to always.
Yes, and meaning it's not a commandment that has a rationale behind it.
Because kosher means you just bless your food, right?
No, kosher means that there are certain, the Torah spells out for us which animals we can eat, which birds we can eat, which fish we can eat, as well as different types of produce. Certain circumstances around produce we're prohibited to eat. So anything that is within that framework is kosher or non-kosher.
I think what she was trying to get to is, would that bird be kosher if it took care of other birds?
That's a very theoretical question. That's not the nature of that bird. So the rabbis gave a reason for why that bird, even though it's called kindness and it takes care of its young, it remains unkosher. The spiritual messaging around that, not what makes the bird kosher. What makes the bird kosher is or not kosher is the fact that God says it's not kosher. But the reasoning that we apply to it is really more about the messaging we can take it into our lives, is that ego is necessary for us to live. But when ego goes awry, then we have a problem.
So are human beings kosher?
No. No, you're not allowed to. No, it's a legitimate question. You're not allowed to eat another human being. Not that something anybody wants to do on a regular basis, but no, humans are prohibited. We're prohibited to eat humans.
Sorry, I know it sounds bad.
No,
Because I was like, if you eat kosher food, then wouldn't you be kosher?
no.
If you take care of other people.
And a kosher animal is not kosher just because it's kosher. It has to be slaughtered properly. We have to remove the salt from it. If it's not slaughtered properly, you're not allowed to eat it. So just because something inherently is kosher doesn't mean that we're able to eat it. So a lot of laws around kosher. Okay, have a great week. Next week, same time, same station.